What's going on, everybody? Super Tuesday. Oh yeah, we're doing it again. Now you've seen this tree before. We thought this was a Japanese flowering apricot, Prunus mume, but what we ended up realizing is that this is actually an American flowering plum, which I believe they call it Prunus americana. And such a spectacular tree. We did the repot of this tree, we did the styling of this tree on the stream a year ago, and this has been a tree that was left unchecked, untouched, right? Now, typically when we start to talk about ume or we talk about sakura, any of the Prunus varieties, to take advantage of their flowering capacity, we're going to be allowing them to flower in the spring, which this piece has some very elongated pieces that it's going to be flowering off of. The show should be spectacular, being a native Prunus and not a hybridized, multi-flowering, double, triple bloom Prunus. It's going to be very delicate and dainty, and we did get a taste of the flowers last year. We're going to get a magnified display this year, okay? But I'm already thinking, well, once this flowers, the overlap of flowering and foliar production is such a challenging moment for Prunus, because the foliar production is already taking place inside of the tree, and to come back and wire at that point in time is very, very challenging. Now, could I have wired this in the fall? Absolutely, I could have wired this in the fall. Didn't get to it. Am I going to be pruning as I wire right now? Absolutely not. But what am I wiring for then? I'm actually saying, hey, listen, if I knock off a few of these flower buds, we will always sacrifice flowering for the ramification and the evolution of that highly defined developmental structural primary branch formation, that secondary scaffolding pad formation, and that tertiary last little touch of ramification that gives the sense of proportion and scale to the tree. I'm going ahead and I'm going to be wiring at this point in time, exploring whether this piece has the capacity to be dynamic or not, with the notion that if I knock off some flower buds, I'm still going to get the flowers show, but we're doing this in the interest of knowing if we don't wire now, we're literally looking at wiring at leaf drop in the fall. Yes, we could wire while they have foliar mass on it. No, we never want to fully defoliate a Prunus through the growing season. If we wanted to wire in the growing season, probably next time we could touch this tree would be sort of late May, early mid-June, for that second pruning that's going to give us the ramification that's going to flower in the fall. But I would love to be building the tree over the course of this foliar production period of the year. So when I perform that second pruning, it's a touch-up. It's a removal of wire that's sort of tightening and starting to become a little bit too snug. But we really aren't looking to design and have to wire and style this tree in the growing season because we've already done so much work, okay? So we left on this very large structural piece of aluminum. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start by taking this off. Now, the reason that we wanted to focus on this beyond the necessity to continue the process of discussing how we evolved Prunus as a species in bonsai, which I think is one of the more under-discussed species that has the greatest amount of curiosity, because everybody wants a good ume. Everybody wants a beautiful, delicate, rugged, you know, when we say delicate and rugged, that feels contrary. Yes, but that is the dynamic of the flowers that exist on ume. Everybody wants a delicate yet rugged, broadleaf deciduous tree. How do we go about handling that process? And one of the biggest things that we established last time is we said, hey, listen, when we start to deal with trees that have this kind of characteristic, we always want to make sure, in order to empower them with the expenditure of energy to flower, to continue to flower, we've got to get those branches up. And you'll notice in the vigorous parts of the tree with the biggest whips and shoots, those are the ones that are growing most vertical. But when we come down to these lower branches, we start to see, well, the lower branches aren't nearly as empowered. Because, yes, they are lower, and you say, well, lower branches are weaker, but ultimately what ends up happening is the tree kind of loses that perky, vertical, oxen-driven upright growth and kind of starts to fall into this lateral and eventually downward growth. This is death of a branch for an ume, for a Prunus of any species, okay? So first and foremost, just thinking about how do I continue to move this tree forward where the lowest branches have the capacity and are set up for success. The way that we go ahead and empower those pieces is to wire them and bring those tips back up so that they have the same orientation. Now again, I'm wiring so I don't have to come back and wire once it's finished flowering, which we know the finality of flowering overlaps the production of foliage. Before the flowers are done, before they fall off, before you ever want to take them off, the leaf mass is already going to be growing. So if I wait till that point, my risk of damaging the foliar production, the initial leaf buds, which could be absolutely devastating on an ume, the risk of that very high. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try to mitigate that risk by doing some of the work now that I would otherwise be trying to do at that point in time. Okay, I'm going to go with straight copper. Thicker bark trees are Prunus, and in that thicker bark having a capacity to endure and tolerate, right? We had that initial aluminum on this tree. We recognize Prunus quite brittle in terms of its behavior and the way that it responds to heavy bending, especially on the structural level. Now, every time we enter a different tree, a different species of tree, we have to recalibrate. We just worked on apical formation, beautiful Rocky Mountain juniper yesterday that I'm really excited to eventually show you guys. Not quite ready yet, but we are doing some of that apical formation, kind of riding the wave that we've been working with from last week's stream on the Doug fir. And as we were kind of working on that, you know, the calibration to working on a Shimpaku versus a Rocky Mountain juniper is very different, okay, very different. And the reason that it's different, Shimpaku juniper, mounding juniper, has a little bit more of a tight, compact, self-supporting habit in that mounding form. Whereas a Rocky Mountain juniper, we understand Rocky Mountain juniper, running juniper. Rocky Mountain juniper, running juniper. And when we talk about running juniper, we recognize we've got to give, man, it's hard to deny the amount of holding capacity that this prune has had from one single wiring and reworking session over the course of last year is really phenomenal. I mean, these branches barely move. Now, I want to tighten it up and I want to take it a little bit farther. Anyways, I digress. Okay, we have to calibrate. So when I'm coming back to this, I've got flower buds that I'm dealing with. I've got all kinds of nuances that are happening here inside of this tree that I need to be aware of and be very focused on in order to do this work justice. I want to be sure that I allow myself, before I bite off any big moves, that I just give myself the time to kind of calibrate, get the feel, go slow, be nice and deliberate. And this is as much to preserve the flowers as anything else, but it's also just a really smart and intelligent and responsible way to go ahead and handle a tree when you're putting your hands on it after you've been familiar with other species. And I remember taking these kind of turns whenever I was apprenticing, and we would switch, you know, because we would go into the multi-flush mode and all we would touch are black pines for 3 to 4 weeks. And then we would shift into the 5-needle pine cleaning mode, and then we would move to the junipers, and you're just like, holy cow, kind of bouncing around, getting the feel for these different species, these different branching styles, these different tolerances of bending, these different quirks to the crotches and the weak points and the susceptible areas. Okay, and moving into the broadleaf deciduous, and more important, a really brittle broadleaf deciduous, I just want to take it nice and slow. Okay, so I'm just calibrating on this piece right here. Again, a little bit of relaxation from where we had that guy wire. I'm going to put the guy wire back, but I'm going to find a little bit of a cleaner area to attach it to. And what I want you to be paying attention to as I'm working on this is there an opportunity? Is there an opportunity for dynamic design? Is this our defining branch? You know, is this going to be our defining branch? We suddenly have ourselves a tremendous amount of options because now we have a really strong, healthy tree. We've got elongated branching that gives us the capacity to develop, elongation, thickening, healing, expansion of foliar mass for back buds, rebuilding of the root system. These are our developmental goals. If I want to elongate, right, I have the opportunity or the ability to do so finally with just a little bit of that love. It's a good idea to start to think about that because that's going to largely determine how we go about the process of pruning and deciding on the length of these branches once the foliar mass starts to emerge after flowering.
So the chat's pretty hyped about this tree. Love the pot. Backcountry Dan was wondering, where did it come from?
Yeah, this is a tree. This is actually a Mirai student's tree that we've been working on for the past 2 years because it was having a little bit of a health kerfuffle where it came from. And to the best of my knowledge, this piece came from somewhere in Southern California, but maybe it got to Southern California circa the Midwest or the eastern portion of the country, because I think could it have been grown in California? Absolutely. I don't want to take anything away from anybody that may have painstakingly grown this tree over the course of time. But I do think natively, it's native to the Midwest and the eastern United States, and it does feel like a tree that probably had either some domestic urban Yamadori vibes, or maybe was even potentially collected out of the wild. And so from thinking about that, if it was a native tree collected out of the wild, it would have had to have been in the eastern United States. Maybe it made its way here via the bonsai sort of distribution chain, or maybe it was grown from a seed in some sort of urban Yamadori or something like that. But it's hard to imagine this being planted. If you had to make a decision on your flowering trees that you were going to put into your garden, there's so many more spectacular potential options and opportunities. It's hard to imagine this was the choice that was made. Not knocking this tree, it's a beautiful species, but as a native, it doesn't have that same high level of ornamental value that you typically would see in a plant that was sourced for flowering in the native landscape. But no matter where it came from or how it came to be, it would be nice to give credit to the maker or to the original collector, finder, grower, etc. But it's going to be spectacular, moving forward.
Cool. And Backcountry Dan followed up and just said that he's seen these in the Rockies, but a trunk has never looked that good.
Yeah, right. This is a good one, and I think there's like a little bit of middle ground here in terms of where we want this tree, where we want the branching, where we see the front to be. And let me just give you a kind of a once around. I just got right to it because I've been repotting all day. I've decided I'm not going to shave my beard until I'm finished repotting, just as a self-flogging motivation to get through repotting, because I am severely behind and we have a lot of work to get done in a very short period of time. So anyways, I was repotting all day and I was like, oh my gosh, I gotta change gears from repotting, shore pine and lodgepole pine and limber pine and ponderosa pine. I'm trying to get all the pines out of the way in case you couldn't gather that information. So I'm going through all these pines and black pines, and just like some of them routine repots, some of them initial repot, lots of things going on stones, time consumptive, and then I'm like, all right, now I gotta change and go wire a flowering prunus without knocking off the flowers. It's incredibly brittle, and I'm thinking about dynamic design, apex, and defining branch. It was like, whoo, big time abrupt shift. But this is definitely a very special tree, no doubt about it. It is of the native, either created or gathered Prunus that I've ever seen. This is the best that I've seen. Hands down the best that I've seen. Okay, now I'm using relatively thick gauge of wire on this. Okay, the first gauge of wire was 6 gauge. Whenever we're dealing with, this is one of the big deals with dealing with brittle species of trees and handling them responsibly. When you deal with trees that are brittle, you don't want to, and most people tend to get this sort of passive or tentative mentality in their head that it's like, it's a brittle tree, so I better be really delicate with the wire. And it's actually quite the opposite. Brittle tree, the way you handle a brittle tree is you have to use a really nice, thick, confident gauge of wire. If you're not using a thick, confident gauge of wire on a brittle tree, that's exactly how you magnify the brittleness of a brittle tree. Because you wire it and you bend it a little bit, right? I wire, and then I bend and it moves back, and I bend and it moves back, and I bend and it moves back. Now, had you used the appropriate gauge, you bend, it holds, you're done, right? But because we're afraid, because we're hesitant, because we're letting the tree sort of cast a little bit of doubt into our skill set, we use that thinner wire, we bend, it rebounds, we bend, it rebounds, we bend it a little bit more, and at some point we start to lose the sensitivity to the brittleness because we're just so darn determined to get that thing to become what we want it to become. Let's see what happened there. Oh, I see. And all of a sudden, we bend it and boom, it breaks. Broken, done, gone. All she wrote, okay? So when you're handling, I can't emphasize this enough. When you're handling a brittle tree, you got to be using heavier gauges of wire. That's the secret. That's the secret sauce to success when we're handling a brittle tree. Okay, now I just split a little bit of that crotch right there, and of course my callus mate is down in the greenhouse, as so often happens. So I'm going to come back to using a little bit of top gin. Top gin is the orange stuff. Okay, has a, oh no. The cap of my top gin is now toast, which we can take care of this as well, and I'm going to show you what happens if you lose the cap on top gin. Okay, this is antifungal in terms of its behavior inside of the vascular system of the tree, but it does not have the same indoleacetic and indobutyric acid that cause that cellular division and can really cause the tissue to swell. Okay, a little bit of a wire just to clean up the nozzle, and when you store top gin, if you've lost the lid, okay, you put that wire inside of it, and then you can just tie that wire right around the lid right there. And then when you come back to use it, you unwrap that, pull that out, and then you get your top gin again, okay? Good way because the cap does disintegrate, especially if you give it contact with the sun. What do you got for me, Lonnie?
Pro tip. There's plenty of questions, but as an aside, the chat really enjoys the beard. I think they all vote to keep it. Pretty happy with it.
You know what it looks like? When I look at myself in the mirror, I feel like I've just been smearing dirt all over my face while I've been repotting. This is the longest I've ever had a beard in my entire life. This is it. And I was thinking about my dad today because my dad was the most cleanly shaven, dapper-looking dude growing up. It was just like the assumed. It was going to be shaved, brushed, professional, ready to go to work, and that was always my my impression, you know, of a fatherly figure and of a man. So to finally be growing a beard, you know, as I am in my 40s is really an interesting experience. But it's so unpleasant. It's just unpleasant as all get out. And now I admire, or at least have a lot of respect for anybody that's willing to suffer through this thing called facial hair. It's absolutely ridiculous. Okay, so when we get into this, I don't want to, and this comes back to the conversations that we had when we were initially designing this tree. I don't want to be trying to control everything. I don't want every branch to be so tight and defined and controlled and contrived. If I can sort of lighten the tone with the broadleaf deciduous model, if I can focus on a little bit more informality, and again in the world of Prunus, if I can just get that kind of upward shift of the branching on the ramifiable level and use pruning as much as anything to guide the changes of direction and the angularity that we often see in Prunus as a result of the way that they are pruned through bonsai or through fruit and flower production desires, right? Because even in an orchard environment, you're going to see Prunus pruned above a node. It's going to dogleg. It's going to form angularity. You're going to have these rapid transitions of ramification that we talked about and dissected, similar to malice in a lot of ways, right? So when you're thinking about this, and especially because we can sacrifice a lot of flower buds doing the work right now if we're not careful, we are only wiring what we need to be wiring to get the kind of aesthetic that we want and the health out of the branching that we're guiding the position of, okay? So just be conservative. Once you do that initial styling, that heavy layout of the shape and structure on broadleaf deciduous, you're going to have to lay out the secondary scaffolding. After that, when you come back, the work becomes a lot lighter. Just remember, you pay it forward on those first two workings, you start to be able to just manipulate. And it's not saying you're using lighter wire. That's a mistake to think that you do those two things and now we don't ever have to structurally wire again. No, it's using the structural wire that allows you to control 3 and 4 branches as opposed to having to wire 3 and 4 branches because you use too small of a wire on any one of the branches to give yourself the control of anything else. Okay, and that's the technique. That's the key to evolving our wiring practice as we continue to move forward in bonsai, recognizing that using the correct gauge to move that branch wherever you want is what empowers you to wire less and obtain and regain and preserve some of that natural branch shape and that natural nuance that the tree gives you over the course of time with its growth.
Great. And I know we're planning on letting this flower, but Backcountry Dan was wondering, are you going to let any fruit form on these?
Fruit form on these. If we get fruit, I would like to see it. We really had a beautiful, dramatic flowering pear last year. That was in the tree sale with, I believe, a big, beautiful pear on it to boot. That's fun. This is fun to play with flowering and fruiting varieties and kind of get these, get those characteristics to really shine out is a lot of fun. And man, this is poppy right on those junctions. Just small little incisions or small little fractures or cracks that we're seeing. The bigger structure is holding tight, but I want to make sure that I don't damage those fine little junctions where the water flows into those branches. Because remember, what makes Prunus brittle is the fact that they have so much tannic content moving through their tissue. Much like a conifer, that's why they can have deadwood that lasts and deadwood that contributes to the aesthetic over the course of time. But it makes that core wood really, really low water mobility kind of behavior, as well as makes that junction of those branching to that core wood very, very brittle because the center is immobile, right? It's locked up with that heartwood and that lack of water transport. So the more that we damage that connection, pop those sort of little tears and whatnot at the crotches, the weaker and weaker the finer branches in their connection point is going to get. Now, does that mean that we shy away from doing the work we need to do? Absolutely not. You got to do the work. That's the name of the game. It's why we're doing bonsai. So we go at it, but we just go at it with an educated eye and an understanding of the nuances and where we need to exercise caution.
Joe was wondering, when is the best time to wire a wisteria? When it's ready to bloom or when it's more brittle and susceptible to breaking?
So we wired the wisteria last year while the buds were just starting to swell. And so that is happening. Like I've looked at the wisteria because it was sitting right next to this prunus when I just went and got it. And the buds are just starting to move. And I just thought, gosh, you know, I might as well give the wisteria another go around as well because it had such a phenomenal year last year, as did this prunus. And it's loaded with flower buds. So to get its shape really dialed in and taken care of makes a lot of sense to me. That's a really sound strategy if we're looking to try and take advantage of the foliar branching evolution over the course of this spring season. Because we have to recognize, you know, on broadleaf deciduous, especially fast-growing high water mobility, which most of our broadleaf deciduous are fast-growing high water mobility, you're going to be taking the wire off of a tree that's highly refined after, you know, 2-3 months of growth. So you really only get that spring season to take advantage of. If it stays on past that spring season, you're watching, it's not thickening, et cetera, you know that you've got to be aware at the beginning of fall before the onset of vascular productivity, or you can really do a lot of damage. In broadleaf deciduous, we don't like to see that wire scar. It's not like a conifer, okay? So you've got to be a little bit careful, but getting these things wired and getting these things ready to go, especially the pieces, wisteria, another one. Spring flowering like an ume, we know that once it stops flowering, it's already producing foliar mass. When are you going to wire it if you don't wire it prior to flowering? Forever hold your peace until leaf drop or potentially next spring where you're asking yourself the same question. You got to sit down, buckle up, and get the job done, okay? Do it now. Do it now. This is when we want to take care of wisteria. This is when we want to take care of prunus. This is when we want to take care of a lot of our deciduous trees, okay? Now we talk about, hey, what about that whole spring? We can't really prune because things can get, you know, a little slippery and whatnot. Totally true. We don't want to be necessarily pruning our highest water mobility, non-sheen based, Japanese maples, trident maples, some of our beeches and things like that can excessively, you know, bleed moisture. If they're bleeding, go ahead and stop pruning. Wait till the post-flush hardened stage and then come back and prune. But as far as a majority of our sheen-based, which is all flowering, fruiting species of broadleaf deciduous, wiring right now, pruning right now, absolutely okay. Does it give you the same distribution of hormones to balance the energy for a tree that is in a high level of refinement to the same degree that we get in the fall at leaf drop? No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. We miss that. But at least we can control energy distribution And the ramification, we can stop the strong from getting stronger and the weak from getting weaker by not eliminating those terminal buds on the strongest shoots before these trees push into full-year growth this spring. This is one of the areas that allows us to compensate. We acquired a new tree over the winter. It wasn't pruned last fall. We weren't sure of strength, health. We wanted to repot things. Who knows all of the factors that contributed to that, right? Got an early snow. We were a little nervous. We had to put it away. The leaves got cooked in the fall, so we didn't prune it because we didn't know if it had the strength to respond. All of these things, totally acceptable. Come back now. Now is a good time. As long as it's not a species that's going to bleed, now is a good time to take advantage of the behavior, of the waking up, etc., to transition energy. You are not going to get the same even distribution, but at least the strong are not going to get stronger and the weak are not going to get weaker. And that is an important thing to be able to control in our bonsai. If we miss ideal, we've got to have fallbacks. And spring pruning on our broadleaf deciduous, although not ideal, is definitely a fallback. Okay? So I'm kind of working on this branch, and let me just show you where I'm at here. Okay, I'm happy with that. I'm happy with this lowest left area. And again, this is very, very long. These are very, very long. I'm going to leave those long. Notice that we're kind of getting that same angularity, and we even picked up these bottom pieces. Anything that was laying down, we picked it up. So all of these pieces down here, go ahead and bring me in tight. Show me that, Jesus. Okay, notice that. That's the look that I want. That's the ramification of prunus that's going to allow you to flower and perpetuate the strength in the lowest branches of the tree. Most of those were down here. I picked those up like that. That's what's going to empower them to have the same equality of strength as the upper portion. And again, we'll complement that with pruning. But, here's where we're at. Is this my defining branch, or is one of these my defining branch? Okay? Because if one of these becomes my defining branch and my apex is coming back this way, guess what we just got? Defining branch, apex. We got a dynamic design concept to a broadleaf deciduous right here. And this is very, very common when you get into this elongated, very delicate, elegant, we're out here very far, our base is a great distance away, we've got to turn the apex back for that functional use of dynamic apical formation. But our defining branch has got to fill that space so that we don't just have this void below that trunk. And that's where you see this branch returning on this tree is filling that space, but it's not creating a tremendous amount of length. We've got this piece right here, whereas this one's going back, that one's going here, and our apex is going here. Suddenly we start to have this really interesting, unique interaction of apex and potential defining branch. Now they're all going to be staying long because we're going to let them flower. This is not the time to prune prunus. We let it flower and then we prune prior to the onset of full-year growth. But it's something to think about as we sort of set the structure and work through the branching. Can dynamic anchor this tree? I absolutely think the tree has the characteristics to hold dynamic design.
I know you just answered this question, but just to reinforce the timing, Marty asked earlier, what trees can this work be done right now? All deciduous that haven't bud out, trident, elm, etc.?
Totally. So our sheen-based broadleaf deciduous, which is all flowering and fruiting, okay, all flowering and fruiting our sheen-based broadleaf deciduous, as well as our sheen-based hornbeams, elms. I'm going to be doing elms. I'm going to be doing, trying to now I'm like rapidly trying to think of all of my sheen-based broadleaf deciduous. And whenever you try to do that and force it, it never ends up happening the way you want it to. Yeah, but yes, you can do this on a majority. Now, what do you want to avoid? What pieces do you want to avoid? This is where I think it's wise to avoid Japanese maple pruning. Okay, some people do it. Some people say I've been pruning, every spring for the entirety of this tree's life. And I would say, okay, has that tree reached a super high level of refinement? Maybe that sort of stops somebody in their tracks to say, ooh, it hasn't. I might have had a hard time refining this tree. What does that mean? Does that, have I had a hard time refining this tree because I've been pruning it in the spring and that potentially is taken away from some of the sugar starch loading that gives rise to really good branching formation or allows me to do the partial defoliation I've never quite had the strength to do? Some of the practical timing and nuance of work for a lot of the species that we work with in bonsai is impacted by small changes, small manipulations, small understandings of strength distribution. And when you prune a deciduous or broadleaf deciduous in the spring and it heavily bleeds, what that tree is telling you is it has such a tremendous loading of sugars and starches. And I'm just teasing this tiny little branch out and away. Okay, has so much sugar starch loading that when you open that cylinder where that concentration gradient of the tree trying to even out its sugar starch content, because the tree's been withholding. Remember, over the course of winter, the tree withholds the capacity for a tremendous amount of water to move through the system. So now all of a sudden this tree is pumped full of sugars and starches that were its antifreeze, that was its winter tolerance, that was its winter hardiness. And it's saying daylight length and temperature are triggering me to start to let more water into the system. I need to move that sugar and starch loading out to the tip of the tree where the foliar growth is going to take place. It's going to fuel cellular division. And we say, oh man, this is awesome. But at the same time, we don't want to be exhausting all of that sugar and starch. What's hitching a ride on that water that's leaking out of your tree? What's hitching a ride is the sugars and starches that are trying to make it to the tip, and they get all the way to the tip, and then we open up this sieve and it starts spraying water out, or just very slowly and indiscreetly leaking it out. It's not quite so dramatic, but it could be if you wanted it to be, right? And we say, is that okay? Is that okay? And the answer is, yeah, once it's okay. Once in a while it's okay. On an annual basis, it probably will deplete the tree of some of its stored energy that tree had planned on allocating towards branching, foliar production, et cetera, and it probably means that the tree is functioning with a slight degree, right, of crisis or loss of energy systems that it had planned on, which means it can't do everything that we oftentimes are told in books or that we see in magazines or that our neighbor in Bonsai is able to accomplish with their trees, and we don't know why, and a lot of times that's what's happening. It's just a small energy shift, a small energy depletion in the tree, and suddenly we don't get the same result, and we're trying to figure it out for a long time, right? So if you see that bleeding, you need to stop, even on a tree that's not supposed to bleed. If it's bleeding, stop pruning, right?
Great. Treebeard Steve says that there's a problem with fire blight in some of the Prunus americana on their property in Indiana. Do you have any recommendations?
Oh man, fire blight's a tough one, huh? Fire blight is a tough one. I mean, resistant varieties is typically, the sort of automated response to fire blight susceptibility. And if there is fire blight, this probably isn't a tree that you'd want to be cultivating as a bonsai, because as a bonsai, trees are a little bit more susceptible to disease than some of the things that, in-ground growing varieties of the exact same tree might be tolerant to. And so I would say that might be a little bit of a deal breaker for you to be able to cultivate Prunus in your area in a bonsai container. But I don't have any cures to fire blight. I don't have any solutions. Sterilize, prune at the appropriate time. Obviously, they tell you to destroy infected material and burn it so that it can't spread to everything else. That's always a tough thing to do, but sometimes something that we have to go ahead and bite the bullet on. But more than anything, I think it's just understanding, and honestly, the longer that I grow Rocky Mountain juniper in the Pacific Northwest, I'm going to continue to grow Rocky Mountain juniper in the Pacific Northwest, but God, it is a monster to grow here. It is just because it's wet. And Rocky Mountain juniper and ponderosa pine, these are arid climate trees. Ponderosa pine is far more, believe it or not, far more adapted to the moisture of the Pacific Northwest than the Rocky Mountain juniper. We have to work hard with our western junipers in the Pacific Northwest. It's a similar thing, right? We also have to work hard here. There's an apple orchard right up the road from us. Cedar apple rust is a nightmare. We've got to constantly be removing it off of the sort of cyclical, hawthorns, pears, apples that we have in the bonsai garden so it doesn't get to our junipers. So always something to keep you on your toes. But fire blight, that's a tough one.
Technique question from Gary. What makes it okay to use copper wire without paper towels on this species? Yeah,
good question. Okay, so thick-barked broadleaf deciduous. I typically use copper wire over aluminum wire just because I can get away with a lighter gauge and it holds better, right? So when we start to talk about this, Prunus is a very thick bark broadleaf deciduous species, which means that the abrasive nature of the copper wire does not cause the bark to be damaged nearly as easily or at all, right? The only time really that you see Prunus being susceptible to a little bit of damage is when the branching is green after this new growth emerges, and if we were going to try to wire and put any sort of shape to that new growth come post-harden, which I'm not a big fan of trying to wire Prunus at that point in time. I find it to be more damaging than anything. I would much rather be handling Prunus right now. But the paper towel is really designed to reduce the abrasive surface of copper wire on thin-barked broadleaf deciduous trees. Your Japanese maples, your trident maples, your Chinese quince, and even in the quince, once you've done the major structural setting, we use it on the linden a lot. Once you do that major structural setting, we can oftentimes come back with copper wire doing far less application with less heavy gauges, and we can get away without that paper towel, or we can move to aluminum and avoid the paper towel altogether. But again, the copper is not going to cause this tree an issue because it is a much thicker bark, much rougher bark variety of broadleaf deciduous that can tolerate that abrasive nature of the copper. Okay, now I'm sort of having a little bit of a conundrum here in this branch off to the right, and I'm just sort of kind of positioning it in a way, and I feel like our front, let me just kind of find our front here because we haven't actually called that out. Certainly can't be there. Probably can be there. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just make a nice little copper thing here. I'm going to drop it right down in front of the pot there. Okay, our front is there to camera. Okay, somewhere in there. See how this trunk straightens out there? We keep some of that movement. There's a nice little hiccup right in there. Okay, somewhere like that, right? Now what I've got here is I've got this diagonal forming on this piece, and I'm dealing with a species that's very, very brittle. So it's hard to come back in here, and there is a little bit of length that's playing with my perception of what is in terms of this design, but I keep trying to drop this branch down. And the more that I drop it down, the more diagonal that this pad gets. And there does come a point where you start to look and you start to say, okay, if I drop this down and down and down, and I create this diagonal here, I don't really have anything to occupy this space. What happens if I move this branch up? What happens if I fill this space with this branch instead of continuing to try and drop it down and down and down? So I'm just sitting here kind of convening with myself about whether I want to go ahead and try to go up with this piece. Okay, and I'm just going to come up a little bit. I've got to be very, very careful. And then can I come down becomes the question. Can I come down here? Come on down. Can I come down here with my thicker wire? Come back up. Okay, and I want to show you this, and I just want to see what you think about that. It does create a relatively flat pad through that middle. Okay, a little bit flatter out there, but we can get some of the variety. I don't know, I can come back down just as easily. But just in looking at it, if I can start to, and ultimately what I would love is I would love for the branch here to be long and this one to be the shorter, but the long one's on the inside and the shorter one's on the outside. And I want the shorter one to consider dynamic design because gosh, wouldn't that be awesome? But it's just not working. Yeah, I'm forcing it. Any way that I go about it, I'm forcing it. And the more that I force it and the more that I fidget with it, the more opportunity we have for disaster to strike. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to accept it down. I'm going to try to bring some of these branches up, and I know I'm going to try to get this some length. So if I'm going to try to get this some length and I want this to be something fantastic, guess what? I've been handling everything as if I'm carrying it up into its position as a refinable branch that I'm going to try and ramify. This one, I need this length on. I need to get some developmental work in there, especially if I'm considering dynamic as a potential design option, and I certainly am considering dynamic as a potential design option. This is going to be one of the few elongated branches tonight that we wire to put it back into a developmental phase. Right? This will probably be the only junction on this tree that I actually have 3 wires convening in a single location. And let me just go ahead and shortcut trying to move this very delicate piece that I have already risked moving multiple times. Good. It's 12 gauge. 12 gauge. And I'm not saying you need to wire branches that thin with 12 gauge, but I'm saying I need at least 12 gauge on this bigger, thicker piece here to be able to intentionally engage with some sort of developmental move to change the nature of this branch. Okay, I've got tight internodes through a majority of this piece. Now, Prunus, when we bend Prunus, has almost like a celery type of character to it. Okay, it can be quite fleshy. So when I start to get out in here, I can be deceived. Now I've got these, and Josh, can you kind of focus right in here on this piece right here? Yeah, bring me in tight. Good, okay. Notice the generations here. I've got my smooth gray branch. I've got my scales, my leaf scales here where the sort of the nodes existed. This was my terminal bud last spring. And then this big long growth is what was produced. Now this is quite flexible. The junction at that point for Prunus right there of last year's new growth to the beginning of the growth where it started last year, this is incredibly brittle. Gets a little bit more flexible back in here. That is the point where all of the damage, where that little layer that connects the vascular tissue wants to crack and break and reduce the ability for water to transport through that piece of tissue. So this is where the celery, this is where the vascular tissue becomes more like celery and wants to tear and split. I have quite a bit of mobility here, but I want to protect that area, that very base point of the origin of last year's growth. And then again, every single piece I want to be orienting up and out. That's how I give strength to Prunus. I can always come back and I can put a little bit of different movement in there. I can shift things, change things, etc. But I've got to be getting that up and out in order to give that the appropriate capacity to become a strong contributing branch, okay? Little guy up there. All right, so we're going to accept, and notice how far that is out to the right, okay? You see that branch moving out to the right. You see that apex coming back. If that starts to give me a lot of that direction, and that gives me that asymmetry, we're going to start to pull on dynamic because it comes from the inside, comes from here, moves past the apex and that branch overlap. That is that dynamic moment for us, okay? That is that dynamic moment for us. All right, I'm going to work on the back side here, give ourselves a little bit of depth, answer some questions.
Great. Ricky D wonders, so when do you collect ume? Do people generally collect after they flower?
Ume, this is the perfect time of year to be collecting ume, right now. Right as they're starting to flower. In fact, a lot of people, depending on where you are in the world and what species of Prunus you're collecting, a lot of people utilize this time of year to see them flowering so that they can identify them. We do have a native, it's like a red plum, and we also have a native cherry that flowers, you know, sort of less than stellar fruit production and less than stellar beauty in the flowers, but still a native. And Randy will find those in the woods by letting them flower and then using the flower as the indicator. It's optimal time for repotting post-flowering, optimal time for pruning post-flowering. That's kind of your signal for work when we're dealing with Prunus species in general.
Joshua has a fun question. Can you talk about tall pots versus shallow pots, and if one plays into the dynamic concept better than the other?
Pot does not necessarily matter, okay, for the dynamic concept. Deep pot for sheen-based broadleaf deciduous, shallow pot for non-sheen-based broadleaf deciduous. And if you put a sheen-based broadleaf deciduous into a shallow pot, you will see sort of a steady and slow over 2 to 3 year decline of the strength of the tree, loss of its finer ramification, reduction in its flower fruit production, and ultimately, if there's not something done, potentially that tree can sort of fade into oblivion. The sheen-based broadleaf deciduous model demands that we really focus our efforts on maximizing health in the root system. Okay, and so the deep pot for this was not necessarily a root criteria. And in fact, this tree came out of a relatively shallow pot, but it was having health issues. We went into the deep pot. We left it untouched last year in terms of pruning. We wanted to get strength back into the branches. We wanted to empower that water flow and the otherwise dry tissue that can occur in a prunus branch. And now we finally have a tree that's reestablished, and that deeper pot, probably one of the bigger reasons and contributing factors to the rise in the health of this particular prunus, because that pot allows that sheen to establish, allows that flowering mechanism to really start to work. And if you wanted to get really deep into it, if you wanted to get deep into this, these are some of the discussions that, you could say are being triggered by the apical, by the apical testing that we've been doing. Because you start to say, okay, well, does a deeper container have a different dynamic? We say the sheen, and there's a gravity column, and you have a higher gravity column, which means there's more gravity acting on that soil column or on that water, which means more water is being pulled out after we wet the tree down. And that means that more oxygen is coming in almost immediately, right? And the reason that we tilt a tree up on an angle to move water out of the container is so that when we move water out of the container, oxygen gets into the container. And we understand the faster that you can exchange water and oxygen, the healthier a tree will be, right? The faster you can exchange water and oxygen. Now, there's an aesthetic to that. The shallow container is an aesthetic that we like, and that is the more shallow you get, the slower water and oxygen exchange in the cultivation of bonsai, right? But there's probably another step to it, which is to say, does a deeper container have more or less magnesium accumulating? Since we know magnesium settles at the bottom of the container, maybe it's more stratified, and less magnesium helps these trees have more calcium, and more calcium builds stronger cell walls and allows a plant to flower, okay? Does magnesium have an antagonistic relationship with potassium? Does potassium and calcium occupy different components or different locations inside of the soil system? And because of that, we start to see a deeper container in a flowering and fruiting tree facilitate available potassium with available calcium. Probably all of this exists, and there's probably a significant amount of nuance to even an inch or maybe even a half inch of depth difference in a same tree, same pot scenario in terms of water, oxygen mobility, as well as nutrient availability, toxicity, balance, and proportional equality in terms of the energy system of the tree. We don't have those answers to those questions, but I am thinking about it strongly because we're entering now this will be our second full year. Yes, we are entering our second year. By this fall, we will have completed 2 full years with apical, but I can tell you already, the health in the trees this spring is really something. It's really something, and it's not outlandish vigor. It's not this robustness. It's just big buds, consistent back budding across old wood, and trees that are really coming out of their dormancy with a lot of promise. We'll see if it holds up.
And I dropped the link in the chat earlier, but I'm going to send it one more time. We actually repotted this tree on a stream, and so you can see the previous pot versus
the
new
right,
pot.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good.
And check out the whole ume primer.
There it is.
Okay. Speaking of, Bentley was wondering, what's the scope of work for a prunus that's going into refinement?
Prunus that's going into refinement. I mean, I would say that we are strongly working on secondary with some of these pieces potentially starting their refinement. But if you were in a Prunus in refinement, you probably wouldn't be needing to wire as much. Although I do, again, my theory on broadleaf deciduous a little different than a lot of other people, okay? I want to see it be a good tree first, and I want to continue to see it be a good tree over the course of time. So if we're talking about just simply refining distribution of energy, etc., post-flower pruning is of pivotal importance. Now, it's going to be of pivotal importance even for this tree, which is kind of in secondary with some of the pieces going into tertiary refinement, okay? But that post-flower pruning is what takes off this terminal tip. The terminal tip has all of the auxin in it, right? And if we allow sugars and starches through transpiration to move to the most transpirational location on the tree, the tips of these are going to run and the interior branches are going to start to get weak and die because the tree said, oh, I started to accumulate that much auxin last year. I wasn't touched in the fall, which is the point where we most evenly distribute auxin from the fall over the winter for the most even distribution of tertiary ramification come springtime. Now we know for flowering and fruiting in the spring, Prunus especially, we don't touch it until it's flowered. So we can't do that leaf drop pruning. It means that post-flower, pre-leaf pruning is so incredibly important for refinement. And that would be your focus. If you're not wiring, you're not styling, and you're just saying, listen, what do I need to do for a Prunus that I'm continuing to refine? Be sure that once that flowering is over, that you hit that as soon as you possibly can, right? Once you enjoy that flower, you enjoy that seasonality and that gesture, you go ahead and you prune that back to two tight internodes on last year's new growth, right? So Josh, go ahead and bring me into this piece here so that we can see what's going on because I want to talk about those internodes. Yeah, bring me in tight, Jesus. Okay, when I say I'm going to prune back for refinement on this, let me get my scissors. Okay, notice I have last year's junction right here. That is the delicate leaf scale. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to cut off that coarse, okay, pruning piece. 1 on the right, 2 on the left. I'm pruning right there. Okay, I'm not going to leave any more than those 2. Now notice how tight these internodes are. That's awesome. I love that. I think that's great. Does not serve me at all to leave more than 2. Doesn't serve me at all to leave more than 2 because only one of these is going to produce ramification, or if I leave 3 and only 1 produces ramification and partial defoliation, I can trigger the others. No, we don't think about that, okay? Because here's the deal. With Prunus, even though you leave 2, 3, 4, it's all about the energy that exists in that branch, whether you get 1 or 2 or 3 triggered germination or growth, right? Stimulated growth of tertiary branching. And we're saying, listen, but Ryan, you said we can't prune in the fall to get even distribution because we sacrifice flowering. That's exactly right. Now, if you want to sacrifice flowering, best thing to do is prune in the fall. You won't have any flowers, but you would get the most even distribution, and that would be the trigger for the highest level of ramification, okay? Number 1, I didn't get to it. Number 2, I wanted to see this thing really flower with the growth that we allowed to occur. We're going to get a show, and then we're going to go ahead and go back and prune. But we may sacrifice some of that interior ramification that we otherwise could have triggered because the strong have stayed strong. We're going to be reducing those and causing massive energy shifts. The big pieces that we cut back this spring are going to be very retarded in their growth in terms of when they start. Because we're going to leave so many of the smaller tips unpruned, they're going to take off. And in that, we sort of strike a balance. We'll partial defoliate and prune in that post-flush hardened state, and then we won't touch it again. Hopefully, by those 2 prunings, we can achieve energy balance. But again, if you want the very best ramification, you want the very best energy distribution, you sacrifice flowering and you prune at leaf drop in the fall.
You ready for more?
Ready.
Cool. James was wondering, does cut paste stop the bleeding? They listened to the Dennis Votia podcast this weekend, and he mentioned pruning his maples in late winter. Seems like he's finishing up pruning by the end of February.
Yeah, and so, you know, this again is the thing where Dennis's approach to broadleaf deciduous, undeniable, okay, undeniable. Has best deciduous in the national show, several, not all, but several of the years that he's entered trees into the national show. His ramification, the elegance of his Japanese maples is absolutely beautiful. Dennis prunes them in the spring. He doesn't handle them in the fall. I have other clients on the East Coast that prune their Japanese maples in the spring. They say they bleed a little bit. Some of my clients in the Northeast say, listen, if I prune in the fall, it actually bleed more than they do in the spring. And it's like, okay, well, listen, there are exceptions to every quote-unquote rule, right? The idea is a majority of locations throughout the Northern Hemisphere, if you prune a non-sheen-based, high water mobility broadleaf deciduous, i.e. Japanese maple, trident maple, some of our other high water mobility species, they will bleed water, and that bleeding of that water is taking away the sugars that tree needed to do what it planned on doing that year, okay? And how do you prevent that? You prune in the fall. I prune in the fall and they bleed worse. Okay, well then you prune in the spring, but that's a nuance to the accepted common rule or commonly accepted behavior of the species on this Northern Hemisphere.
Great. Ricky D says, so I noticed that the 50 to 60 degree angle for deciduous can be a little tough to make tighter bends on smaller trees. Do you ever tighten your angles for deciduous compared to conifers? I know all the techniques you apply are still effective with the 55 to 60 degree on deciduous, but sometimes it's easier for me to make a sharper bend with a 45 to 50 degree angle.
Yeah, I think there are any number of ways in the creation process where you can fudge and sort of manipulate some of these things, Ricky D. So if you're finding that to be in the way that you're bending, where you're applying the pressure, the kind of movement that you're trying to get out of your deciduous, you're finding that a tighter angle is giving you less breakage, more control, tighter bends, then you gotta go with that. You gotta go with that. Okay, if it's giving you, listen, if you say, I'm going to continue to abide by the 55-60 even though it's not functioning for me as well in this particular endeavor of getting tight movement in a young broadleaf deciduous that I'm trying to train interesting movement into. I'm not going to be there with a silver star going, Ricky, way to stick with it, man. Like, thank you. You got to do what works well for you. I think the challenge is, right, that is probably a very... that is a slightly unique scenario where the 45 is going to be more effective than the 55-60, because I'm using 55-60 here on an incredibly brittle tree. Now on an incredibly brittle tree that's relatively mature, so I'm not trying to put necessarily radical movement in. But even if I was trying to put radical movement in, the radical movement that I would be putting in would be coming from using foreground, midground, background, up, down, left, and right, three-dimensional movement instead of trying to get that tight, two-dimensional, heavy change of direction that puts so much force and torque and pressure on brittle trees, right? So there's ways to achieve that regardless with the 55-60, but there's nobody that's going to be there congratulating you on the fact that you stuck with the 55-60. If you have better function with a different technique, you got to go that direction. That's how you customize your bonsai practice.
Quick shout out to Josh and Jesus for the close-ups. The chat's loving it. Okay, Treebeard Steve asked, could you explain briefly your plans for developing that year-old shoot that you could hope would become the sacheta development over the next few years?
Yeah, so the sacheta, right? Because now everything else is built and I'm going to be pruning it. But this is exactly when we can get this sacheta built, right? Because when you have too much of your tree in a developmental phase, you can't refine any of the pieces, right? There's just not the energy that you take away from a piece that you're trying to refine. If a majority of the tree, and we say this is that 70-30 thing, right? You can only refine your tree if 70% of your tree is in refinement stage. If any less is in refinement, right? 60, 50%, half of it's in refinement. The things that you prune to get refinement out of are going to get so weak because you've got too many pieces consuming the energy freely that aren't in a strength balancing, right? When we're in development, we're not in a strength balancing phase. In fact, we're trying to get as much strength moving through that piece as possible to accomplish those developmental goals. So when we're talking about here, 90% of this is going to be in a post-flower pruning phase, and I've got that one branch that I'm going to be developing. That's actually when I get the very, very best out of development in a broadleaf deciduous. I'm not going to prune that though, right? And here's where this works, is this is only one branch. Everything else is going to be pruned, dialed in. Happens to be a lower branch, so it's already, although it's generating a lot of length, it already is sort of at a disadvantage being lower on the tree. We give it that upward angle. That's what empowered it last year. This one piece can develop and it won't take away the strength from everything else because only, 2-3% of the tree is in development. That's where it works. And that's also where I fertilize for refinement, and the pruning process of holding back the stronger pieces in the refined area is what pushes that strength into the developing piece, so that even with a refinement fertilizer strategy, I'm getting a developmental growth in that very limited number of locations that I'm developing, and in the case of this tree, that single location that I'm developing.
Joe was curious, what mixture of soil is used for this tree and the ratio?
Yeah, I go 100% Akadama. And I go 1/16 to 1/4 on ume, and they absolutely lap it up. They love it, okay? But again, the priority with ume is that you've got to have good oxygen exchange, right? It is as with any other flowering and fruiting species, it is a sheen-based broadleaf deciduous. That means it has to have, sheen-based means it has to have. It's not a high enough water mobility to stay wet or to want to stay wet. It doesn't need as much moisture as a Japanese maple. It wants to dry out. It needs to have rapid oxygen exchange. That's where that deeper container facilitates the health that allows me to get away with the use of Akadama, okay? If I don't have all of the parts of the puzzle put in place, it doesn't matter what soil I put this tree in, it's going to suffer from an imbalance of water and oxygen and all of those preferences that I'm citing here. Those are preferences sort of that are not necessarily unique to Prunus, but unique to sheen-based broadleaf deciduous that demand that rapid water-oxygen exchange, okay? Higher, deeper pot, higher necessity for water-oxygen exchange.
I'm going to turn John's question into a game called Sheen or No Sheen. Okay, American hackberry.
American
no sheen.
hackberry. Hackberry. Celtis in a very hot, humid area can be non-sheen based, right? You can flatten them out, you can get them to grow with an incredibly radiating root spread. They tend to be a lot like a trident maple, where they want to produce these big, thick roots. But if you handle them correctly from the beginning, you can absolutely get Celtis to plate out, okay? Typically, what would Celtis be? Typically, Celtis would be a sheen-based, much like an elm, much like any of these very almost weed-like, rapid-growing, hot, humid environment, adapted but temperate, cold-tolerant species. Sheen-based is where they typically thrive. But again, a Zelkova, you can treat a Zelkova or train a Zelkova to be non-sheen based. You can treat an elm or train an elm to be non-sheen based. But historically, hackberry, elm, Zelkova are all sheen based broadleaf deciduous trees.
Okay, and to keep the game going, hornbeam?
Hornbeam, the epitome of sheen based broadleaf deciduous.
How about a winged elm?
How about a what?
Winged elm.
A winged elm, good question. Winged elm, definitively a sheen-based broadleaf deciduous. Now, but here's the thing. You're going to see these big, huge, legs, which winged elm is notorious for this, these big sort of single log-like root, and it's got suckers growing up off of it, and you cut both sides of it to harvest the winged elm sometimes, or you take the parent, or you find, whatever you find, and you say, well, this doesn't have much of a sheen. And it's like, just because it doesn't have much of a sheen doesn't mean that it abides by being able to be cultivated in a super shallow container where there is very little gravity acting on the column and it has a slow water-oxygen exchange. Okay, that's really the big key to the whole sheen, non-sheen based behavior. And winged elm grows in arid. Listen, Japanese maple is not growing in arid conditions. Okay, beech is not growing. Japanese beech is not growing in arid conditions. Stewardia is not growing in arid conditions. These are growing in high moisture conditions, right? And so when you start to think about this, when you're dealing with trees that grow in arid conditions, they inevitably have to have a sheen. They lean on their sheen. They base their health on that sheen. That is a huge part. So you talk about quercus. You talk about any of your elm species, ultimately, if they're not trained that way from youth, depend on that sheen. You talk about your hornbeams and some of these that are a little bit more foothill tolerant, drought adapted varieties of broadleaf deciduous. It's a really interesting native environment adaptation to bonsai cultivation, technical handling that starts to cross over and become what I would consider to be relatively intuitive once you start to connect the dots and recognize the patterns of behavior.
And finally, a buttonwood.
A buttonwood, oh, as a tropical, yeah. So buttonwood, tropical, but tropicals are all broadleaf evergreen, every one of them is sheen-based. Now you can call my bluff on that and you can say, dude, now we know you're full of crap because the olive tree, you can flat cut, it doesn't need tremendous roots. How can you call olive sheen-based when you can literally cut any branch off, stick it in water or excuse me, not water, sorry. Stick it in soil and it will root. Doesn't have any impact on whether olive is a sheen-based or a non-sheen-based. Boxwood, olive, camellia. What are some of our other, any of our quercus evergreen varieties? All sheen-based, all sheen-based. Broadleaf evergreen, we never bear root, we always leave some portion untouched, all sheen-based.
And that wraps this segment of sheen or no sheen.
Now we did it, now.
We did it.
I'm gonna be upset if you guys are asking me that question when there's a whole lecture about sheen out there where we go through the list and we basically break it down to almost everything is sheen-based except for a handful of high water mobility, very alpine or cold climate adapted broadleaf deciduous species. And again, the Japanese maple is our reference. That kind of forms the real catalyst for the whole discussion. That's that central pillar species, just like the Japanese black pine becomes one of those reference species for the pine discussion, whether we're talking multi-flush or not. Really, you know, pine knowledge in the United States started with Japanese pine bonsai, black pine bonsai, and then we started refining from there how that didn't apply to the ponderosa pine, to the limber pine, to the Japanese white pine. That's where we based all of our knowledge off of. That's how broadleaf deciduous is with the Japanese maple. That's really where the knowledge came from and started, and then we've just been building from there to be able to understand this broadleaf genre of growth.
Nice. Okay, I'm going to ask some questions a little bit out of order just because we're on the sheen train right now. How about an ilex?
An ilex. Oh, well, flowering and fruiting. You got a sheen-based.
Okay, and does that mean that the salix is non-sheen based since it grows quickly and can be flat cut?
Non-sheen based, Salix, Babylonica, right? Or any of the Salix for that matter, which we're talking about willow as a non-sheen based. We're talking about birch as a non-sheen based. We're talking about tamarisk as a non-sheen based. Absolutely. Now tamarisk a little different. You could even say willow's a little different if you're really trying to promote willow flowering, which is kind of not spectacular, but in a bonsai form can be really rewarding just to see, you know, sort of the process and the seasonality of willow. But ultimately, yeah, willow, when you go back in, you clean a willow up and you start to work on a willow in a bonsai root system, you can absolutely clean out the downward growing roots, create the fine water conductive lateral base that we would aspire to achieve in a Japanese maple. And willow will produce that plated out effect, or will at least behave better in a bonsai container when we take off those big, thick, downward growing roots and we transition to a more refined tertiary root system.
Okay, and now someone hopefully is recording all these for flashcards, but how about an amber maple, sagebrush, or birch?
Okay.
Sorry.
No, you're totally fine. Birch would be a non-sheen based tree. In terms of high water mobility, has the same characteristics as tamarisk and willow for the most part. Same for the most part, right? All of them. And it wasn't until I went to Tunis Jan's place in Rotterdam after the trophy back in 2020, pre-pandemic. Whoa, that was a crazy trip. Right when everything was kicking off, I was in Rotterdam at Tunis Jan's, and he had a tamarisk, and I was like, God, how do you get your tamarisk to not die back? And he said, oh, isn't that fascinating? Yes, these are what do you call them? Water submerged species. And that was where birch, where like the light bulb went off for me with all things broadleaf deciduous. That was where birch started to make sense to me. That was where tamarisk started to make sense to me. That was where willow started to make sense to me, because you had this kind of new genre, that is to say, this genre, these trees exist in heavy, almost standing water or submerged growth. They grow fast, they grow aggressive, and they die back readily, because when the strong get too strong and you cut them back, they abort or abandon producing cellular division at collars. They abandon the collar to become a rapid growing, high water consumption, right, tree that's taking in all the resources it has at that moment. They're short-lived because of that, right? The longer-lived trees grow slower. The longest-lived trees in the world grow the slowest, right? And so when we start to think about that, and that's not universal because obviously the redwood is very fast-growing, but for the most part, that is true, right? For the most part, that is true. And so when you start to see that rapid growth, rapid consumption, there is a loss of some characteristic, and it's the compartmentalization characteristic, which is why everybody's had this experience who's tried to grow a birch. You grow it, you cut it, it dies back down to the trunk or below it, and you're like, just lost everything. Yeah, you got to grow it slow. And this is where Dennis Wojtyła started to talk. He's pruning, he's growing them slow, he's growing them slow. That's the secret to Dennis's approach. Now, there's hybrids to that, right? But we have to understand that, and we also have to understand, okay, so for a birch, we can take the sheen away. For a tamarisk, we can take the sheen away. For a willow, we can take the sheen away. But we still have to understand that we've got to be watering appropriately, we've got to be guiding and dictating distribution of energy in that tree more consistently in order to keep it from growing, dying back, growing, dying back. That success is characterized by the pruning process.
Okay, and back to ume. Marcia was curious. I came to have a very old ume that is weak. I need to repot it, and it only has one good branch at this time. It flowered, but it has not leafed yet. I assume I can repot now, but leave the branch alone till next spring or later. What would you do?
I guess I would say, are we repotting for a health-related situation? Or are we repotting for an aesthetic situation? If it's a soil is decomposing, tree is in poor health, it's continued to deteriorate, and I need to repot it, then it doesn't matter, right? You got to do what you got to do. Sometimes things go awry, and we've got to step in, intervene, and fix it, especially if there's only one branch on the entire tree. Okay, but if you only have one branch on the entire tree, that also makes it easy because there's nothing to be done as far as aesthetic manipulation, etc. Right? Repot it, let the tree produce as much foliar mass as it possibly can, let that foliar mass harden off, let that foliar mass continue to exist on the tree. We don't even want to prune it then, right? Because you need all of that to rebuild the battery of the tree, especially if you're going to repot and you're trying to get recovery, okay? So it sounds to me like there's nothing to be done on that tree in terms of pruning, styling, etc. But if you're saying, we're saying, well, it's a stylistic change that I want to make on the tree. It's actually, you know, I repotted it. It's in pretty good shape, you know, but it's a little bit unhealthy. Yet I want to make a stylistic change. It's like, well, you don't get to make that stylistic change at this moment, then, right? Because the tree's unhealthy. And those stylistic changes, those are real luxuries that we have to be able to alter the state of a tree that's in really significant health, okay? So if it's in poor health, repot it, don't touch the foliage. If you're repotting to fix the health, repot it and don't touch the foliage. If you're repotting it for a stylistic reason, I don't think that you have the strength to go about that process, and I would go ahead and wait. I would wait. I would exercise some patience and some restraint.
Great. And Marcia confirmed repot for health reasons.
Yeah, so you just repot, hands off. And again, I'm going to tell you right now, and I had a student, really good student of mine, who came in, and he has a beautiful lilac. Okay, now a lilac is another broadleaf species, not commonly handled in bonsai. This is a Korean lilac. Korean lilacs have a beautiful proportion to their leaves and their flowers for bonsai cultivation. And he said, man, I don't know, you know, it just hasn't had quite the vigor. Now, Korean lilac and any lilac, obviously, flowering and fruiting broadleaf deciduous tree, okay, sheen-based tree. So I said, you know, have you gone in and have you looked at the sheen? He said, oh yeah, sheen can't be an issue. Sheen's all good, all good. We opened that thing up, and that sheen was so full of stank, dirty, black, nasty, anaerobic, going south quickly. Nothing was going to get healthy in that circumstance if that sheen was left unworked. And so we went at the sheen very heavily in that repot to try and rebuild the sheen, knowing that a sheen-based broadleaf deciduous, you know, has to have the sheen taken care of, or else nothing positive is going to come from anything that we do. Okay, you might have that situation with your ume. You're going to have to bite it off, figure out what's going on, and fix it in order for that to return and recover. Okay, now, few discrepancies here. There are some conflicting concepts to the design of this tree, okay? There is a notion that our defining branch is coming back this way. There is a strong insinuation that our apex is moving to the right. Okay, and I started to kind of play with it. Do we bring that towards the front? Do I drop that right side down to try and get orientation to the left? Obviously, if I go about the pruning process where I shorten the right side and I start to elongate the left side, I shorten the right side, I elongate the left side, I shorten the right side, I elongate, I shorten, I elongate, and then I elongate here. I can turn my apex back to the left. I shorten my branches on the left, I elongate my branches on the right, I can turn my defining branch to the right. Okay, so just because this is up here doesn't mean this has to stay here, and in fact, this is here, but these pieces right here are actually going to be where I'm going to start to build my ramification. And I'm going to shorten this piece to start to pull it back and push the apex back in that direction, should I choose or want to pursue dynamic design. But again, priority right now is flowering because we've gotten to this point. The flower buds are there. I can't distribute the energy because I already missed that window at leaf drop in the 2 to 3 weeks post leaf drop where sugar starch distribution is evening out hormonal content across those buds. I might as well wait it out. Once it flowers, coming back, and maybe we revisit this tree at that time and really talk about pruning to execute the capacity for dynamic design. But I think we've set ourselves up to have the branching in place that allows us to push into dynamic design, and I think we have a broadleaf deciduous piece of material with a slight degree of rotation through this trunk, the slender, irregular movement, and the defining branch and apex really localized on that central line of the shoulder of that defining branch where the apex and that defining branch interact having the capacity to execute dynamic design with all of the characteristics anchored here. You could also make an argument that the apex coming back as a functional redistribution of that visual weight is going to be far more visually and physically stable over the course of time. Dynamic design as a function as well as an aesthetic opportunity. The material meets both potential needs, and we see how the pruning process is going to very much inform and potentially need to be a very intentional gesture towards dynamic, towards tension, towards harmony, depending on which of those three directions we choose to go. But again, dynamic is where my mind is at for this piece of material.
Great. And we have a handful of questions, skipping order real quickly. Can you just point out the defining branch for Danny?
Okay, if I had to point to a defining branch right now, I mean, I'm going to say it's this one. But you can already see how much more potential the right side has over there. And this is really where I'm conceptualizing the defining branch moving into this space right here, where I'm going to hold back this as a nice little ramified sub-pad, and I'm going to build this out into that region as a defining branch. But in doing so, I have to pull the apex back. If I push the defining branch out that way, and I continue to push the apex out that way, then we're going to become visually and physically incapable of holding this position, because yes, we have a powerful base, but we have a big, long, slender trunk. The farther and farther we go, it is going to become physically and visually unstable. So bringing that apex back, if I want to push that direction with my defining branch, that's the relationship that allows us to push asymmetrically while holding the visual and physical stability. And I think the material has the characteristics to anchor dynamic design.
Great. Mike says, do you think the best strategy to approach deadwood creation on a prune, or what do you think the best strategy is to approach deadwood creation on a prunus, and how should the stump cuts be handled on this tree?
Yeah, I mean, because prunus is not going to deteriorate very quickly, or if at all. And I generally would say, hey, listen, take a motorized tool, remove, just sort of a central piece of the wood that allows you to then pack that with sphagnum moss, keep it moist, allow that wood to deteriorate. It's working wonders on my hedge maple that you guys have all seen on the stream multiple times. The center continues to, I drilled down through the dead core where the top had been cut and there had been a lot of dieback, and I just packed it full of sphagnum, and I would just water it anytime I would water the tree, soak that, and maple wood, right, deteriorates relatively rapidly. It's getting nice and punky, and that naturalizes that. I just pull out that pithiness and that punkiness. It will not deteriorate and rot all the way into the living tissue. And once I get enough deterioration to naturalize that opening that I made, I'm happy. I'm happy with that, right? When we talk about prunus, prunus does not deteriorate like that. You'd be waiting 10, 15 years and still you won't have any punky wood that gives you any more of natural texture than you had when it was a stump cut. And so I think from that perspective, it is wise to go ahead and act on deadwood in the form, when we're dealing with prunus. Now, do you want to act on it with a motor, or do you want to act on it with hand tools, chisels, gouges, etc.? If you have the skill set, prunus is an incredible wood to be using chisels and gouges and splitting and tearing and opening up natural hollows and pulling fibers and really getting that wood to show you the texture, right? And not every wood character allows you to pull fibrous pieces or strands out of the vascular system, but prunus will. However, the tree has got to be rock solid, very healthy, have an established and firmly planted root system, because prunus wood is so hard that the amount of force you have to apply to split and use chisels on prunus demands that the tree be very, very established. And so I'm actually working on this scenario with one of the prunus that I styled on one of the mini streams long ago. Every single one of the branches on the side where the field-grown ume was stump cut died off, and that whole section of the trunk died, just as probably a matter of sap recession from it being dug 2 or 3 years ago and making the adjustments, right? So the entire right side of the tree is alive, the entire left side of the tree is dead. It's all in line with the stump cuts. It makes perfect sense to me. but now I've got to do something with those stumps. Well, I need another 2 to 3 years to get the root system built up to where I can go work on that Prunus deadwood and not do a tremendous amount of damage to the tree. Okay, that's what I got to do. If I want the best possible product, carving figure, texture, grain into deadwood, you know, is possible, but very, very challenging. And ultimately, hand tools are always going to give you the best result.
Kurt was wondering, did Mr. Kimura do Mume for the Taikian show?
Did Mr. Kimura do Ume for the Taikon 10?
I bet that's
maybe. Little autocorrect action there. I never saw, during my apprenticeship time with Mr. Kimura, I never saw Mr. Kimura do any. No, I take that back. Yeah, we did do Ume. In fact, we did Ume every year for the Kokufu. We would at least submit one, if not 2 or 3. Usually we would submit a few sakura, which are cherry trees, cherry blossoms, and periodically we would exhibit chojubai and Japanese quince, bokeh, right? Canamelius japonica, which the reason that I remember and know this is because we built these big ice boxes to try and stop them from flowering, or we would put them into the hothouse, which was the heater room inside of the greenhouse, to get them to flower so that they were hitting the right timing mechanism for flowering during the judging, beginning flowering at the judging and full flower at exhibition. Every year we had to really deal with temperature control to get that done.
Brady was wondering, could you talk a bit about why dynamic design is called dynamic?
Dynamic design is called dynamic to quantify. So again, design is the product of the trunk, the defining branch, and the apex. Right? Trunk moves to the right, defining branch moves to the right, apex moves to the right, harmonious design. All 3 of your primary elements are getting along, okay? The trunk, being the defining central pillar of the tree, moves to the right, defining branch and apex move to the left. This is tension. Your apex and defining branch are ganging up on the trunk. They're working against the trunk. It creates anxiety or tension in the design. But when you say, okay, so these 2 elements that for most of bonsai design, 95% of bonsai design, harmony and tension, makes up the vast majority of bonsai design, or ambiguous, which is not a compliment, right? Ambiguous design is not something to aspire to, but it always fits in there. There's Kokufu ambiguous, there's European ambiguous, there's a lot of North American ambiguous, where it's like, is it moving to the left or the right? Does the apex have a direction? Is there a defining branch? The trunk is centered and doesn't really go anywhere anyways. Ooh, there's a lot of things we could do to take this tree to that next level, okay? I digress, right? To explain the conflict of the apex and defining branch disagreeing, right? The trunk is no longer the focus. It's the criteria of that central plane of the shoulder of origin of the defining branch and the apex, and its close proximity to that point where that shoulder of that defining branch exists, and it's countering that for a physical redistribution of the weight to gain functional balance or functional capacity for the tree to stand up, or a visual redistribution of the weight because we have dynamic characteristics in terms of rotation, which we have in this material. We see that most in junipers, which is where dynamic design is the most dominant, okay? You know, that explanation, the complexity of that conflict of apex and branch and the criteria of what has to be in place visually to encourage you to pursue it or functionally to encourage you to pursue it is a dynamic system. It's a dynamic set of circumstances. It's a complex scenario that we have to set up dynamic design that will visually and physically work for our tree. That's why we call it dynamic. And it also is that really rare design moment that can respond to the most valuable visual character we can accomplish in trees, which is rotation. That is, listen, when you see a tree spiraling in its growth, it is undeniable. You look at it and you say, yeah, that is cool. That's cool. I think that is cool. You see a tree that has great deadwood and great live veins, and they parallel each other from the base all the way out, and you're like, wow, it's old deadwood. that's a neat tree. But when you see that live and dead spiral, or you start to see, a Doug fir where the bark wraps around itself, and you're just like, what? How does that? Or you see a barber pole ponderosa, it's like, God, that's crazy. That's crazy, right? You have to have a visual to complement that opportunity. That was dynamic.
Cool. Bentley was wondering, can you outline the decision to drop the lowest left branch across the trunk?
The decision to drop it across the trunk was to, and if you go back, when we repotted it, we also styled it. That was the Ume primer where we handled the roots and the foliar mass of the tree. If we left this where it originally was, which was out here, we had the big ball. Right? And so when we dropped it down across and below the trunk, right, and there are, it's kind of tough to see where it's at there because there's a lot of things happening, and it's not the strongest branch, so I don't want to really reef on it too much, but I could pull it in a little bit more if I really wanted to. I don't really need to. It's a little tough. There you go. That's the front in a better proximity right there where you can see the spacing and sort of the branching and whatnot. But that is what allowed us to create asymmetrical design. And again, broadleaf deciduous, the ball is not a good broadleaf deciduous design. Yes, cytokinin-driven growth gives you informal billows. They should have spacing, alteration of heights, planes, etc., to create the same exact asymmetrical dynamic as a coniferous tree has. No, they're not conical in form. No, they're not driven by auxin. Yes, they are round and billowy in form and driven by cytokinin. There still is no excuse to lack asymmetry in the design, and that's really what led to us. We either take it off, which that certainly was not going to happen because this negative space under the tree here needs to be filled, right? So that's why we dropped it down. But this is really the branch that I think occupies that space to the right side of that movement. Apex comes back, that branch keeps going, and you've got all of the magic of dynamic headed into this design.
And that does it.
Oh, I love it. Best investment we could have made at Mirai was building the deciduous fence. The deciduous garden is surrounded by a Roman compound of a fence. And it has really allowed us to pursue broadleaf deciduous at a much higher level without the impediment of deer and a number of other animals. And inside of that, we have had a very cold winter here, really cold. I mean, we've been down in the low teens a lot. We've had a lot of snow. We turned the lean-to doghouse into a cold shelter for our deciduous, where we just drop some plastic and put a little heater in there to keep it from getting much below, say, 25 degrees. And it really has been the cat's meow for a temporary structure, as well as sort of that total compound for the deciduous. And I'm not saying, hey, you guys should all go out and get yourself one of these big fences and some lean-to doghouse or whatever that you retrofit. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's interesting how you can use space and structure to empower your bonsai process. And I continue to marvel at the opportunities that those two relatively small gestures have made for Bonsai Mirai. Anyways, we are deep in repotting. The beard will continue until it's done. Let there be facial hair. Love you guys. Mwah!